Hawaii, 1915. When you think of Hawaii, the image that comes to mind is paradise, white sand beaches that look like sugar, palm trees swaying in the warm Pacific wind, the sweet, intoxicating smell of hibiscus and plumeria. But in 1915, for thousands of people, Hawaii was not a paradise. It was an open-air prison. It was the setting of a slow-motion horror movie where the monster wasn't hiding in the shadows, but in your own skin. Close your eyes. Forget the tourism. Forget the colorful postcards. I want you to imagine the smell, not the smell of tropical flowers, but the smell of rotting human flesh, the sickly, metallic, cloying scent of wounds that never close, covered by dirty bandages. The sound isn't of ukuleles playing a happy tune. It is the sound of dry, deep coughing. The sound of shuffling feet of people who have lost feeling in their feet or the toes themselves. The sound of muffled crying behind closed doors, of mothers separated from their children. We are talking about Hansen's disease. Leprosy. The most feared disease in human history. The disease that the Bible calls a curse and that modern society treated as a crime. In 1915, if you had a suspicious spot on your skin, a numbness in your arm, ... your life ended in that instant. The police came. They didn't arrest you for committing a robbery or a murder. They arrested you for existing. You were hunted like an animal, ripped from your family, your job, your dignity, put on a boat with other condemned souls, and taken to Kalaupapa. Kalaupapa, a remote peninsula on the island of Molokai, a place of stunning geographic beauty and incalculable human suffering, surrounded by 1,000-meter-high cliffs on one side, stone walls impossible to climb, and by shark-infested waters on the other. A perfect, natural prison, a place where people were sent not to be treated, but to wait for death. No cure, no hope, no return. Once the boat pulled away, you were the living dead. The entire world was on its knees before this microscopic bacteria. Old, renowned, decorated white doctors in Europe and America scratched their heads in despair. They tried everything: mercury, arsenic, hot baths, prayers, superstitions. Nothing worked. The bacteria, Mycobacterium leprae, was invincible. The medical verdict was always the same, stamped with coldness, incurable. But in a quiet, poorly ventilated laboratory at the University of Hawaii, far from the spotlights of Western medicine, someone was working. It wasn't a white man with a white beard and a monocle. It wasn't a famous doctor with decades of experience. It was a young woman, 23 years old, black. In a time when women could unvote and black people were being lynched in public squares in the American South. Her name was Alice Ball, and she was about to do what centuries of male medicine had failed to do. She was holding a test tube that contained the key to opening the cells of Kalaupapa and freeing thousands of people from hell on earth. But this isn't just a story of scientific triumph. If it were, you would know her name from elementary school, right next to Marie Curie or Louis Pasteur. This is a story of a crime, a calculated intellectual theft, a brutal historical erasure. Because when Alice Ball died, tragically young, her work didn't die, it was stolen. A white, powerful, ambitious man entered her lab, took her notes, and put his name on her cure, and the world applauded him for 80 years. Stay until the end, because today we are going to exhume the truth. we're going to dust off the forgotten archives, and we are going to give Alice Ball the one thing science couldn't give her in life: the immortality of her name. To understand the miracle, we need to understand the alchemist. Who was Alice Augusta Ball? She was born in 1892 in Seattle, but she wasn't an ordinary girl. Her grandfather, James Paul Senior, was a famous photographer, one of the first black men in the United States to master daguerreotype primitive photography. Think about that. Think about her childhood. Alice grew up watching her grandfather mix dangerous and fascinating chemicals: mercury, iodine, silver salts. She grew up seeing magic happen in a dark room. She saw how clear liquids, when combined in the right measure, could reveal invisible images. For her, chemistry wasn't a boring school subject. It was the family business. It was liquid magic. It was the ability to reveal the truth. She was brilliant in high school. She got perfect grades in science. At the University of Washington, she didn't just get one degree, she got two: pharmacy and chemistry. In 1915, she received an offer that would change her life: to get her master's at the University of Hawaii. She accepted. She packed her bags and crossed the ocean. She arrived in Honolulu. Imagine the scene: a black woman, young, beautiful, with elegant posture, walking the halls of academia in 1915. The stares of disdain, the heavy silence when she entered the classroom, the whispers. What is she doing here? Shouldn't she be in the kitchen or cleaning the floor? Does she even know how to read? But Alice didn't care about the noise of ignorance. She cared about the molecules. She became the first woman and the first African American to obtain a master's degree from the University of Hawaii. And, due to her undeniable competence, she became the first woman to teach chemistry there. At 23 years old, let's look deeper into the reality of that shadow. When Alice arrived in Hawaii, the world was at war. World War I was tearing Europe apart. But in the Pacific, the war was silent and biological. The stigma of leprosy was worse than the disease itself. To be a leper was to be unclean, to be less than human. The law in Hawaii allowed bounty hunters to capture suspected patients. Imagine living with that fear, checking your skin every morning in the mirror. A red spot, a numb patch, the panic of being taken away. Alice knew this context. She walked past the hospital. She saw the faces. When she entered the lab, she wasn't just doing abstract science. She was fighting a system of exile. She was fighting the social death that came before the physical death. She was studying the chemical composition of the kava plant for her thesis. Her work was so precise, so elegant, that it caught the attention of a desperate man, Dr. Harry Holman. He was the doctor in charge of the Kalihi Leprosy Hospital. He was on the front lines. He saw people die every day in his arms. He saw children being dragged to the exile boats. He needed a miracle. And he saw in Alice Ball not a black woman, but a brilliant mind capable of solving puzzles. He went to her and said, "I have a problem that no one can solve, and I need the best chemist I know." The problem had an exotic and frustrating name: Cholmugra oil. Let's talk about this oil. For centuries, in Eastern medicine, in India and China, it was known that the seeds of the Cholmugra tree could help with leprosy. There were ancient legends about kings cured in the forest by eating the seeds. But there was a gigantic problem for modern medicine, a chemical and physical problem. The oil, in its natural state, is horrible. First, the taste. It is incredibly bitter, nauseating. It causes violent vomiting. Patients who tried to drink it vomited immediately. The stomach rejected it before it could be digested and take effect. Second, topical application. Rubbing it on the skin didn't work well. It was sticky, thick, and didn't penetrate deep enough to kill the bacteria living in the nerves and under the dermis. Third, and worst of all, the injection, the nightmare. Doctors, desperate, tried injecting the pure oil under the patient's skin. Imagine injecting thick cooking oil or grease under your skin. The oil doesn't mix with blood. Blood is water-based. Oil and water don't mix. The oil sat under the skin, forming hard bubbles, abscesses. The pain was excruciating. It felt like the skin was burning from the inside out. Patients preferred leprosy to the injections. They ran from the doctors when they saw the needle. Chalmugra oil was the only hope, but it was a useless hope. It was like having the cure for thirst, but the water is frozen in an indestructible block of ice. Scientists all over the world tried to make it soluble, tried mixing it with other chemicals, tried heating it. They failed. The oil was stubborn. The molecular structure was too complex, too viscous. Dr. Holman handed this impossible problem to Alice. Alice, we need to make this oil injectable. We need it to enter the bloodstream without causing pain and for the body to absorb it. We need to turn it into water. Alice accepted. She didn't have computers to model molecules. She didn't have digital equipment. She had glass tubes, Bunsen burners, basic reagents, and her brain. And she had something else: haste, urgency. She knew that every day she spent failing in the lab, someone else was exiled to the island of death. Another family was destroyed. Alice Ball began to work. And when I say work, I mean obsession. She taught classes by day to pay the bills and spent nights and weekends in the lab, alone. The smell of ether, alcohol, and sulfur impregnated her clothes. The hum of gas lamps was her only company. Dr. Holman later described her as an extremely good laboratory worker. Very careful. That is an understatement. She was a virtuoso. The chemical process she was attempting, creating ethyl esters, is volatile. It requires precise temperature control. 1 degree wrong and the batch ruins or explodes. Alice did this without digital thermometers. She did it by feel, by sight, by the color of the flame, by an instinct honed from childhood in her grandfather's daughter. And consider the physical toll. The ventilation in labs back then was poor. Fume hoods were primitive. She was boiling acids and oils. The air she breathed was thick with toxic chemical vapors. She wore no modern protective masks. She gave literally everything she had. Her breath, her vitality, her lance. What was the chemical challenge? Converting the fatty acids of the oil, which were thick and insoluble, into something water. She needed to break the molecule and rebuild it in a lighter form. Many tried before her and created unstable or poisonous compounds. Alice developed a radical and innovative technique. She isolated the ethyl esters from the fatty acids. I won't give a complex chemistry class here, but what she did was genius in its simplicity and execution. She subjected the oil to specific temperatures, mixed it with alcohol and a catalyst, and then, the crucial part everyone ignored, she froze the mixture to separate the useless byproducts that caused the pain and abscesses. She washed, purified, repeated, repeated, repeated. Hundreds of times, and then, eureka. One night in 1916, Alice holds a flask against the amber light of the lab. The liquid inside isn't the thick, dark, viscous oil from before. It is clear, golden. It is fluid. It moves like water. She had done it. She had created the world's first injectable and absorbable Chaumugra extract. It didn't hurt when injected. The body absorbed it immediately. It traveled through the blood and attacked the bacteria where it hid. She didn't call the press. She didn't throw a party. She didn't seek fame. She took the flask and handed it to Dr. Holman. "Try this." The clinical trial began. Holman began injecting patients at the Kaliai Hospital. The result was, for that time, biblical. Opened wounds began to dry and close. Skin spots began to disappear. The bacteria began to die in blood tests. Patients who were condemned to be sent to die in Kalaupapa were discharged. People who never expected to see their families again went home. No new deformities, no contagion. It was the first time in the history of medicine that leprosy was successfully treated and chemically reversed. It wasn't just a palliative treatment. It was, for all practical purposes, a functional cure. At 23 years old, Alice Ball had saved thousands of lives. She had done the impossible. She should have won the Nobel Prize. She should have become rich. Her name should be in every hospital. But fate is cruel to heroes, especially if they are women and black. September 1916. Alice is in the lab. She is teaching a class, demonstrating an experiment. Suddenly, she feels ill. Violent coughing, a sudden tightness in the chest, dizziness. She has to stop. She goes back home to Seattle to be treated by her family. What happened? Official records are vague. Some say it was exhaustion. But the most likely theory, supported by newspapers of the time and the nature of her work, is darker. A lab accident. Chlorine gas poisoning. Alice inhaled toxic vapors during her intensive experiments. Her lungs were burned by the very chemicals she used to save the world. She sacrificed her breath so others could breathe. December 31st, 1916. The last day of the year. Alice Ball dies. 24 years old. So young, so brilliant. The flame went out. And this is where the story stops being just a medical tragedy and turns into a moral crime. Alice didn't have time to publish her results. It all happened too fast. She had the lab notes. She had the detailed process. She had the clinical success in patients. But she didn't have the finalized scientific paper published with her name on it. The work was raw in her notebooks at the university. Enter the villain of this story, a white-collar villain, Dr. Arthur Dean. He was the president of the University of Hawaii. He was also a chemist, but above all, he was an ambitious, vain, and unscrupulous man. With Alice dead and far away in Seattle, Dean entered her lab. He took her notebooks, took her formulas. He analyzed the Ball method. He saw the gold it was worth. He saw the glory. What did he do? He didn't preserve her memory. He continued the work. He slightly refined the process to allow for industrial mass production. And then ... He published scientific papers describing the miraculous cure for leprosy. And he called it the Dean Method. He erased Alice Ball's name from history. It wasn't an accidental oversight. It was deliberate. It was surgical. He knew she was dead, knew she was black, knew she was a young woman. Who was going to complain? Who was going to believe that a 23-year-old girl had discovered this? The word of the university president against the ghost of an instructor. He received the laurels. He received the credit. Arthur Dean didn't just steal the work. He industrialized it. He took the credit for the mass production of the drug that was shipped all over the world from 1920 to 1940. If you had leprosy in Brazil, in India, in Africa, or in Europe, you were treated with the Dean method. Doctors praised Dean. Universities praised Dean. Built an entire career on the corpse of a 24-year-old girl. For decades, medical books spoke of the Dean method or the Dean derivative. The world cured leprosy using the injection Alice created with the sacrifice of her lungs, while the man who stole her notebook was applauded at international conferences. Alice Boll was buried in an unmarked grave. Forgotten, erased. The perfect robbery. How many times has this happened in history? How many ideas were stolen? How many names were scratched out of books just because they didn't have the power, the voice, or the right color to defend themselves? The theft of intellectual property is violence. The theft of legacy is a murder of memory. It is killing the person twice. For nearly 90 years, Alice Boll was a ghost. The Dean method was the global standard for leprosy treatment until the 1940s, when cell phones were discovered. Thousands of people were cured, and none of them knew who to thank. But the crime is not perfect. There was a witness, an honest voice in the midst of corruption. Dr. Homan, the doctor who asked Alice for help. He saw what Arthur Dean did. He saw the injustice. And in 1922, 6 years after Alice's death, he tried to correct the mistake. He published a medical article where he explicitly wrote, challenging the powerful Dean. The method of creating ethyl esters from Chalmagra oil was developed by the late Miss Alice Boll, M. He tried to give her the credit. He insisted on calling it the Boll method. But Homan's voice was drowned out by Dean's publicity machine. The university and the scientific community supported their living, powerful president, not a deceased black instructor. It is a classic case of the Matilda effect, the systematic repression and denial of the contribution of women scientists in research, whose work is often attributed to their male colleagues. Alice Boll is the ultimate symbol of this injustice. The truth remained buried in a footnote of an obscure medical journal, gathering dust. Decades passed. World War. Cold War. The world changed. The 70s. Two people begin to dig in the Hawaii archives. Dr. Catherine Takara and Dr. Stanley Ali they find mentions of a young black chemist in the old files. They see the discrepancy in the dates. How can it be the Dean method if this woman did the work before? They find her photo. They realize the theft. It was like finding buried treasure, but the treasure was someone's dignity. They started a campaign, not for money, but for historical justice. It took years. It was a battle against forgetting and against the bureaucracy that protected Dean's reputation. But the truth is like Alice's injection, fluid, potent, and unstoppable. The resilience of truth is fascinating. It waits in yellowing papers. In 2000, finally, the University of Hawaii, they placed a bronze plaque in front of the only Chalmagra tree on campus, a tree Alice certainly touched. The plaque read, Alice Augusta Boll. They admitted it. The Dean method never existed. It was always and will always be the Boll method. In 2007, the university posthumously awarded her the Medal of Distinction, the institution's highest honor. The governor of Hawaii declared February 29th as Alice Ball Day, but the greatest monument to her isn't a plaque. It isn't a medal. It isn't a day on the calendar. Her monument is the families. It is the grandparents, great-grandparents, who were able to leave the hell of Kalab, who were able to hug their children without fear of contagion, who were able to die at home, in their beds, surrounded by love, and not in an isolated leper colony. Every person cured between 1916 and 1945 carries in their blood, in their lineage, the legacy of Alice Ball. Today, at the University of Hawaii, students walk past the Chalmugra tree. Some stop to read the plaque. Most walk by, but the tree is there, a living witness. Its seeds are still wrinkled and ugly, but inside them lies the secret that Alice unlocked with her mind. We must remember that progress isn't always a straight line drawn by famous men. Progress is often built by the quiet, the overlooked, by those who work in the dark corners of history. Alice Ball didn't seek fame. She sought a solution, and in doing so, she became immortal, even if it took us a century to realize it. The next time you see a medical breakthrough, ask yourself, who is in the footnotes? Who is in the background of the photo? Because often that is where the real genius lies. Alice Ball taught us that brilliance has no color, no gender, and ultimately no expiration date. Her light shines through the fog of time, brighter now than ever. The tragedy of her premature death is outweighed only by the magnitude of her gift. She gave the world a way to touch again, to hold hands again, to live again. And for that, we owe her not just a plaque, but our eternal remembrance. This is the story of the chemist of hope, the woman who broke the ice around the cure. Alice Augusta Ball. Remember her name?